My son woke me up at 1:47 in the morning because he thought it was raining inside his room. I came down the hall half asleep, and before I even hit the doorway, I caught that sour, damp smell again. Not dirty laundry, not a wet towel. That cold basement smell old buildings get when water has been sitting where it should not be. Eli was standing on his bed in dinosaur pajama pants, inhaler in one hand, blanket in the other, staring at the wall behind his dresser. Dad, it smells weird again. The back corner of the room looked darker than it had at bedtime. I pulled the dresser out a few inches and saw the same thin black line at the baseboard that Darren's handyman had painted over 2 weeks earlier. Only now the paint itself had started to swell. Little bubbles, soft and shiny in the lamplight, like the wall was trying to breathe through the latex. I told Eli to grab his pillow and sleep in my room for the rest of the night. He asked if that meant he could skip school if he kept coughing. I said no, then felt like a jerk, because he was wheezing just enough that I had already started counting the seconds between breaths. This was the part I hated admitting to anybody. It had not started that night. It had been a cycle for almost 2 years. Rain, damp smell, black line, complaint, wipe down, fresh coat of paint, text from Darren saying it was surface staining or normal condensation. Then a few dry weeks where I could pretend the place was fine and not think about how hard it would be to move while paying child support and trying to keep Eli in the same school district. I rented that duplex because it was 12 minutes from Eli's mom's place, 8 minutes from school, and barely inside what I could cover without eating into everything else. I kept telling myself I only needed it to hold together, just long enough to keep one stable room for my kid. I got a towel and wiped the baseboard. Brown-gray streaks came off on the fabric. Not a lot, but enough to turn my stomach. Then I pressed my thumb against one of the bubbles and the paint gave way with almost no resistance at all. Water pushed cold against the drywall paper underneath. That was when I knew this was not another patch job. It was the same leak still there, sitting behind a fresh coat of paint. I took 6 pictures right there in the dark, then one with Eli's inhaler on the nightstand in frame for scale. At 1:59 a.m., I sent them to Darren. Darren answered at 7:12 the next morning with the same tone he used every time something expensive tried to become his problem. Open the window, run the fan, and stop putting furniture tight against exterior walls. I'll have Rico swing by. I called instead of texting because I wanted him to hear the edge in my voice. He let it ring twice, picked up, and went straight into the landlord calm. If it's the same spot, it's condensation. Condensation doesn't bubble paint from the inside. It does if you trap moisture. You tenants always push dressers right up on cold walls and then act shocked. I told him I did not want Rico wiping it down again. I wanted the wall opened, the source found, and the problem fixed for real. He said, let's not make this bigger than it is. Then he added, you start throwing words like mold around and you create a record you may not like either. I left work early and met him at the duplex around 4. He got out of his truck in loafers and a quarter zip, stood in the doorway, glanced once at the baseboard, once at the fan, then tapped the window lock with 2 fingers. Closed room, furniture against the wall, poor airflow. I showed him the fresh swelling in the paint, the brown streaks on the towel from the night before, and the date-stamped photos from 2 winters of the same corner going dark after rain. Well, if you wanted immediate help, refusing Rico is not the way to do it. I didn't refuse repair, I refused paint. He gave me a little shrug. That's your interpretation. At 6:03 p.m., 2 hours after he left, an email hit my inbox with the subject line, Notice of Lease Violation. It said I had contributed to moisture accumulation through poor ventilation, furniture placement, and failure to maintain the premises in sanitary condition. It said management had attempted to address the issue and that my refusal of access for remediation could affect my tenancy if the condition continued. It ended by warning me against making unsupported habitability claims that interfered with ordinary maintenance. Then I opened the attachments. He had taken the 6 photos I sent at 1:59 in the morning and labeled them tenant-caused conditions. Once that notice hit my inbox, I stopped treating the wall like a maintenance issue and started treating Darren like a man building a story. I pulled up every email I had ever sent him about that room. There were more than I remembered. The first one was from 19 months earlier after a hard winter rain. I had written that the corner smelled sour and the baseboard looked discolored. He replied 3 hours later with, probably surface staining from seasonal condensation. I'll send Rico to seal it. Seal it, not inspect it, not trace it, not open anything. Just seal it. Like the problem was mostly visual and the right coat of paint could fix my eyesight. Rico came the next day with a scraper, a spray bottle, and 1 gallon of off-white paint that did not even match the wall. He wiped the area down, ran a fan for maybe 20 minutes, then brushed over the corner while the drywall still looked damp. He said Darren just wanted it looking clean before the weekend. That bought maybe 6 weeks. The second round happened the following spring. Same room, same smell, same black line at the baseboard. Darren used different words that time because I had started saying mold in my texts. Suddenly it was common tenant moisture buildup and airflow issues in older units. He asked if I had been drying clothes indoors. He asked whether Eli kept the window closed at night. What got me, reading those emails back to back, was how careful he had been. He never put anything in writing that sounded openly stupid. He said things like monitor the area, improve circulation, and we addressed visible staining. Every line sounded calm and reasonable if you ignored the part where the wall kept getting wet. Then I found the lease renewal email from 3 months earlier. He had sent it the morning after Tanya downstairs complained about a stain spreading across her kitchen ceiling. I knew that because her apartment number was on the forwarded chain by mistake. Darren answered her with the same tone, the same phrases, the same little effort to turn water into wording. That was the first moment I stopped wondering whether he was lazy or cheap. He knew there was a building problem. He had known it before he offered me another year in that unit. I read the renewal email one more time, then opened a fresh folder on my laptop and named it after my address. Rico showed up the next afternoon without warning, carrying a 5-gallon bucket, a box fan, and the same dead look tradesmen get when they already know they are there to do something half right for somebody else's benefit. Darren said quick wipe down, he told me before I even opened the screen all the way. I let him in because I wanted to see exactly what Darren called remediation. Rico set the fan in the doorway, sprayed the wall with something sharp enough to make my eyes water, and started scrubbing at the baseboard with a rag that turned gray almost immediately. He was not a bad guy. He just had the posture of a man trying to finish a job fast enough that no one asked him whether it made sense. "You want me to cut this open?" he asked quietly once Darren was not in earshot. "Did Darren tell you to?" He gave me a one-shoulder shrug. He told me to dry it, prime it, and make it look good. There it was. Clean, simple, useless. I asked whether he had moisture readings from the last time. He said no, crouched down, and pressed the drywall with 2 fingers. Even he could feel the soft spot. "I don't want this painted," I said. "Then Darren's gonna say I couldn't finish." "That's fine. Let him say it." Rico stood up, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked around the room one more time. Eli's inhaler was still on the nightstand from the night before. "Off the record," he said. "This keeps coming back because something's feeding it." Then he caught himself like he had already said too much. He packed the fan first, then the bucket. No drywall cut, no moisture meter, no attempt to find a source. He left behind a stronger chemical smell in a room I trusted less than I had trusted it an hour earlier. At 6:41 p.m., Darren texted me. "Rico advises you interfered with scheduled repair and refused access needed to complete remediation. This needs to stop." I stared at that message for a full minute because it was so cleanly dishonest. Rico had not been there to repair anything. He had been there to make the wall look calm enough for Darren to keep calling me dramatic. That was the moment the whole thing changed shape for me. Up to then, I had still been thinking like a tenant who needed his landlord to do the right thing. After that text, I started thinking like a man watching someone manufacture a paper trail in real time. I took pictures of Rico's supplies before I threw the rag he used into a trash bag. I never told Darren what I did for a living because until that week it had not seemed relevant. I spent my days inspecting warehouses, fabrication floors, chemical storage rooms, and older buildings people swore were fine right up until the paperwork said otherwise. My license was in environmental health and safety, which meant I knew moisture mapping, exposure records, sampling protocols, and the gap between what a room looked like and what it could prove. Darren had spent 2 years betting I was just another tired renter with a kid, a budget, and no appetite for a fight. He was wrong about one thing. I was done treating this like an argument about opinions. That night, I drove to my office storage unit and pulled out the bag I used for field visits. Moisture meter, hygrometer, thermal camera, sample forms, evidence tape, nitrile gloves, chain of custody envelopes. Just tools I had used 100 times in places where owners also said words like surface issue and probably harmless before the readings ruined their mood. Back at the duplex, I started at the wall behind Eli's dresser and worked out in a grid. Drywall at the center of the stain, baseboard seam, adjacent corner, closet wall, window trim, numbers first, pictures second, notes while they were still fresh. The room itself was at 48% humidity with the fan off. Normal. The wettest spots on the wall were not. The meter kept jumping where the swelling had been painted over. Then again, 18 inches higher where no stains showed at all. Paint can hide color. It does nothing for internal moisture. The thermal camera showed a dark, cold path running from the lower corner behind the dresser, up past the section Rico had scrubbed, then cutting sideways toward the window line. Not random. Not one little patch from bad airflow. Water had been traveling inside that wall long enough to sketch itself. I took wide shots, close shots, meter shots with the display visible, and one photo of the lease violation notice on Eli's desk, Under the readings from the wall Darren said I caused. By midnight, I had a chronology, a photo set, humidity logs, meter readings, prior emails, and Darren's own notice saved in one folder. At 12:18 a.m., I wrote the first line of a fresh report. Observed concealed moisture pattern inconsistent with tenant-created condensation. Then I ran the thermal camera one more time along the closet edge and saw the cold bloom continue farther than I had expected. I met Tanya by accident 2 mornings later while I was loading Eli's backpack into the car for school. She lived downstairs in the rear unit and usually only said enough to be polite. That morning, she looked at the folder under my arm, then at the window behind Eli's room and asked, "Did Darren finally start blaming you too?" That word too got my full attention. I told Eli to hop in and lock the doors, then I asked her what she meant. Tanya pulled out her phone. The first photo she showed me was a yellow-brown stain across the corner of her kitchen ceiling. The second was the same stain after a storm, darker and wider. The third was water beating along the seam where the ceiling met the cabinet tops. He told me it was steam from cooking, she said. I just stared at her. Steam, she repeated, because even she knew how stupid it sounded once another tenant heard it out loud. Her pictures went back almost a year. Same progression every few months, rain, stain, patch, silence. Then another spot farther down the same line. She had texts too. Darren telling her to run the exhaust fan longer. Darren asking whether she boiled water often. Darren saying older buildings sweat when temperatures shift. Then she showed me the one that mattered. It was a screenshot of a text from Darren sent 3 months before my lease renewal. He told Tanya he would monitor the affected area upstairs and downstairs after the next weather event. Upstairs and downstairs. My unit and hers. Same message, same building section. Months before he offered me another year in that bedroom. That changed the scale of everything. Up to then, I had been building a file on one room. Now I had evidence Darren already knew the problem crossed units, which meant this was never about my dresser placement, Eli's window, or whether I ran the fan long enough after showers. Tanya said she had thought about moving, but first month's rent anywhere decent had gotten away from her. He offered me a renewal too, she said. 1 week after that stain got worse, I asked if she would email me the screenshots and photos with original dates. She said yes before I even finished the sentence. Then she added, "If you're finally pushing him, don't let him in alone." I asked why. She looked up at the back exterior wall and said, "Because he already knows where it's coming from." 20 minutes later, her file landed in my inbox while I was still in the school pickup line. I took the samples on a Saturday because Eli was at his mom's place and I wanted the room still. Gloves on, tape down. Photo of each collection point before contact, then after. Surface sample from the swollen baseboard seam, air cassette near the bed, control sample from the hallway, date, time, room conditions, chain of custody form, signatures. I was not trying to make the room look scary. I was making it hard for anyone to say later that I got sloppy or emotional and contaminated my own evidence. Darren texted halfway through, "Need access Monday to complete remedial paint and seal." I looked at that message while holding a swab tube from the wall he wanted to paint again and laughed once, not because it was funny, but because the timing was almost insulting. I answered, "Do not alter the affected area. Formal documentation in progress." He wrote back in under a minute, "You are escalating a minor issue and interfering with ordinary maintenance." There it was again, minor issue, ordinary maintenance. While the samples were in transit, I called Eli's pediatrician's office and asked for visit summaries from the last year. I just wanted dates. Nights he woke up coughing after rain. The urgent care visit from February when his chest sounded tight enough that the nurse asked whether anything in the home had changed. By Monday afternoon, I had those summaries, the photo set, Tanya's screenshots, Darren's lease notice, and my field notes laid out on the dining table like a spread from a case file. The lab report hit my email at 4:26. I read it once fast, then again slower. Elevated fungal growth in the wall sample. Airborne spore count in the bedroom, significantly above control. Language about active moisture source likely contributing to recurring contamination. Clean, ugly, useful words. Just enough objective language to bury the phrase surface staining forever. I sat there looking at that report and felt relief. Not because the room was safe, it clearly was not. Relief because the problem had finally stopped being debatable. Then my phone buzzed. Darren again. "Rico can be there tomorrow morning. Need confirmation tonight." I looked from his text to the report on my screen, opened a fresh email, attached the PDF, and started typing the words he had been trying to avoid for 2 years. The email I sent Darren that night was the first one I wrote without trying to sound cooperative. I attached the lab report, my photo log, the moisture readings, and a short cover note that said the affected wall and adjacent areas were now part of a formal habitability complaint package. I told him not to alter, paint, remove, cut, seal, clean, or otherwise disturb the area before inspection. I copied county housing code enforcement on the same thread. It felt good for about 12 minutes. Then Darren called. I let it go to voicemail first, listened to him talk himself hotter for 43 seconds, then called back. "You are making a normal maintenance issue expensive," he said before I even got hello out. "You had 2 years to make it inexpensive." This is exactly what I'm talking about. You people hear one scary term and suddenly it's lawyers and agencies? You people? That time I did laugh. "Do not touch that wall," I said. "Inspection is pending." He switched tone right there from angry to fake patient. "You file complaints like this and create problems for yourself too. Nobody wants that on a rental record." That was the cleanest threat he had put in his own voice so far. Just enough to make a tenant imagine future landlords seeing them as trouble. I told him to put any response in writing and hung up. The next day I left for work early and by noon he had sent 2 emails. One said management reserved the right to access the unit for emergency mitigation. The second said my conduct was interfering with ordinary maintenance and increasing owner damages. He was trying to frame the record before the inspector saw the room, so I sent one more reply with the words "preservation of evidence" in the subject line. That evening I got home, unlocked the door, and smelled fresh primer before I made it to the hallway. Not enough to cover the whole wall, just the lower corner, maybe 18 inches wide, right where the worst bubbling had been. He had taken a brush to the exact area I told him not to touch. I took photos before I even set my keys down. Wet edge, brush lines, new white over old off-white, 1 drop of primer on the baseboard, another on the outlet plate. Then I called county housing and added 1 sentence to the file. Owner altered affected area after written preservation notice. 10 minutes later, Marisol's office called back and offered me the first inspection slot the next morning. Marisol showed up at 8:05 the next morning with a clipboard, a flashlight, and the kind of face that told me she had already heard every landlord version of "it's probably condensation." She did not waste time on small talk. She asked when the condition started, whether the child slept in the room, whether prior repairs had been documented, and whether the owner had been notified in writing. I handed her the folder. "He painted after this email?" she asked. "Same day." She made a note without changing expression. Darren arrived 10 minutes later in the same loafers, carrying a smile so thin it looked painful. He tried charm first, called Marisol by her first name after reading it off the badge, said he had always been responsive, said I had become alarmist after reading things online. Marisol let him talk until he ran out of runway. Then she crouched by the baseboard, pressed 1 finger to the fresh paint, looked at the brush line, and asked him whether the wall had been altered after notice of complaint. He said he authorized preventive sealing to protect the premises. Then she asked me if I minded her checking behind the trim. I told her to do whatever she needed. She slid a thin tool under the edge of the baseboard near the bubbled section and pried it back just enough to break the paint line. The smell hit first, wet, sour, old. Then a dark band behind the trim, heavier than what had shown outside. Darren actually stepped forward then. "I think we're getting ahead of ourselves here." Marisol did not even look at him. "No," she said. "We're catching up." That line bought me more peace than the lab report had. She took her own photos, wrote down the moisture findings, and asked to see Tanya's screenshots from downstairs. When she came back, she asked Darren whether he had prior knowledge of water intrusion affecting multiple units. He said he had received routine maintenance complaints consistent with older construction. Before leaving, she taped a bright notice inside the front window, ordering documented corrective action and warning against retaliation after a health and safety complaint. Darren read that page twice, lips tight, then asked if we could handle this privately. Marisol said that was the chance before the complaint. When the door shut behind her, Darren looked at me like I had done something personal to him. Once that notice went up in the window, Darren stopped pretending the issue was small and started pretending I was the issue. The first email came before lunch. It said management had concerns about my hostile conduct, repeated interference with scheduled maintenance, and failure to maintain proper air circulation in the bedroom. The second came an hour later and asked for a written explanation of furniture placement, fan usage, window habits, and other moisture-generating activity in the unit. Moisture-generating activity, like I had been running a car wash in my son's room. By 3 o'clock he had found a new line too. Eli's bed. Darren wrote that placing a bed against an exterior wall could contribute to trapped air and increase condensation risk. His building had hidden water intrusion across at least 2 units. An inspector had seen it, a lab report backed it, and he was now arguing that an 8-year-old sleeping near a wall had created his own hazard. He also started hiding the threat inside procedure. Future access requests, he said, would require written coordination because I had created an unsafe and adversarial environment for workers. I answered each email the same way. Short, boring, factual. Please direct all further communication in writing. Complaint remains pending. Observed conditions predate current week and are documented. Owner retaliation concerns noted. That drove him crazier than anger. He wanted me emotional because emotional tenants sound messy on paper. Around 5, he knocked instead of emailing. I opened the door with the chain on. He held up a legal pad like he was here for a civilized conversation and said we were getting off on the wrong foot. Then he looked past me toward the hallway and asked whether I wanted this kind of record attached to my name when I had a child in the picture. There it was, the real threat under the maintenance language. My son, my stability, my fear that anything formal could spill into the rest of my life. I told him I was not discussing anything off the record and started closing the door. He put one hand flat against the frame and said, quieter this time, "You push this too far, you may end up needing a new place faster than you think." I shut the door hard enough to rattle the chain. Then I wrote down the exact wording while it was still fresh and sent it to myself, my lawyer folder, and county housing. At 7:18 p.m., an envelope appeared taped to my front door. The envelope taped to my door was exactly what it looked like before I even opened it. A cure or quit notice. 3 pages, dense, clean, and mean in that landlord way, where every sentence tries to sound administrative while quietly threatening to wreck your month. According to Darren, I had interfered with scheduled repairs, created unsanitary conditions, damaged interior finishes by unauthorized testing, and made the unit unsafe for vendors. He gave me a deadline to cure the violations or face further action affecting my tenancy. The part that almost made me admire him was how neatly he folded my evidence gathering into the accusation. The swab points, unauthorized damage, the refusal to let Rico paint over the wall, denial of repair access, the county complaint, conduct interfering with management, the room with hidden moisture, my failure to ventilate. He had taken every documented step I made to protect myself and turned it into a list of reasons I deserved to be pushed out. I read it once at the kitchen table, once again standing up, then a third time with my phone recording as I flipped each page. Date visible, envelope visible, posting time noted. What bothered me most was the deadline. It landed right on top of Eli's next custody week. That was not random. Darren knew when Eli stayed with me. He knew exactly what a notice like that did to a parent, already trying to decide whether his kid could safely sleep in that room. I called Tanya and asked if she had gotten anything similar. She said no, but 10 minutes later, she texted me a picture of Darren's truck, parked behind the duplex the night before, right below the rear wall line. That meant he had posted the notice after the inspector left and likely before I got home. I scanned the whole notice into my folder, then sent it to county housing with one line. Owner has now issued cure or quit notice after documented complaint and inspection. Marisol's office responded with a short acknowledgement and a request to preserve the original. Then I sat alone at the table looking at the packet and did the math I had been avoiding. If he pushed hard and I had to move fast, I did not have enough room for a bad decision. Not with rent where it was. Not with child support. At 9:14 p.m., I emailed a tenant attorney and attached the whole file. That night, I did something that made the whole thing feel more humiliating than any email Darren had sent. I packed a go bag for my place, not because I had already decided to leave, because I no longer trusted my options. If Eli showed up for custody week and the room smelled worse, or Darren pushed harder, or the city process slowed down, I needed something between staying put and panicking in front of my kid. So I packed for an emergency, 2 changes of Eli's clothes, his inhaler spacer, allergy meds, his tablet charger, one of the little stuffed sharks he pretended he had outgrown, toothbrushes, my laptop, the folder with every report and notice in plastic sleeves. I put it all in an old duffel and left it by the front closet. Then I opened 3 motel tabs and hated them. One was cheap enough to survive for a few nights and looked like the kind of place where I would wipe every surface before Eli touched it. One was cleaner but far enough from his school that morning drop-off would turn into an hour-and-a-half round trip. The third wanted almost as much per week as an apartment used to cost. That was the part people like Darren count on. Not that tenants believe them, that tenants cannot afford the time between knowing the truth and getting relief on paper. At 8:32 the next morning, the tenant attorney wrote back and asked for a call. Her name was Leslie. She had the fast, clipped voice of somebody who had heard every version of landlord retaliation and was trying to save time by cutting straight through emotion. I walked her through the timeline, the emails, the inspection, the altered wall, the cure or quit notice, and Eli sleeping in the affected room. She stopped me at the last part. You have a child sleeping in the cited room. Prior written notice, a city inspection, and a notice to cure after complaint? Yes. Do not answer him off the phone again. Preserve every original. Do not let him in without notice and documentation. Send me the packet exactly as filed. No speech, no false comfort. Just instructions that made the ground feel less soft under me. After the call, I looked around the apartment and saw it the way somebody else would. Fan running in the hallway, folder on the table, duffel by the closet. It did not look like a home. It looked like evidence trying to live as long as it had to. At 11:06 a.m., Leslie emailed a subject line that made my chest tighten anyway. This is textbook retaliation. Send me everything. Leslie filed the retaliation packet that afternoon. Not just the cure or quit notice. The whole chain, my emails. Darren's warnings about records. The altered wall after preservation notice. Marisol's inspection. The lab report. Tanya's screenshots. Eli's room. Then there was nothing to do but wait and prepare for the version where waiting did not help at all. That was the hardest part of the story for me, not the smell or even the threats. The waiting after you finally do everything right for once. I stripped Eli's bed that night and told myself it was temporary. Washed the sheets, sealed the pillows in plastic bags, moved the mattress 6 inches off the wall, even though I knew the wall was not the real problem. I slept badly and woke up at 5:30 to the sound of rain. That was enough to get me moving. I checked the wall first, damp at the lower seam again. Not catastrophic, not pouring, but there. I took new photos, added them to the file, then loaded the duffel into my trunk. Before work, just in case I had to collect Eli and drive somewhere else that evening, all day my phone stayed too quiet. No new threat from Darren, no update from Leslie, no call from the city. At 3:14 p.m., Leslie emailed one short sentence. Do not spend anything yet if you can wait 2 hours. I sat in my car outside work staring at that line, rain ticking against the windshield, trying not to build 10 different disasters out of 8 words. At 5:02, my phone rang with a number I did not know. The woman on the line introduced herself as counsel for Darren's property company and asked if I had retained representation. I said yes. She asked whether I had incurred hotel cost yet, whether I had moving estimates, whether I still had the original lease deposit receipt. I looked at the duffel in my back seat and finally understood the direction pressure was moving. The next thing she asked was where settlement should send relocation reimbursement if temporary lodging became necessary. Settlement moved fast once Darren's lawyer stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding. Leslie handled the calls. I handled the receipts, hotel estimates, moving quotes, deposit records, the cure or quit notice, the inspection report, and the photos showing fresh paint after preservation notice. By the end of the week, the terms were in writing. Full release from lease with no penalty. Full deposit returned. Relocation costs covered. Temporary lodging covered if needed before the move date. No adverse tenancy reporting tied to the complaint. Documented remediation obligations still running under the city's timeline whether I stayed long enough to watch them or not. That last part mattered to me more than I expected. I did not just want out. I wanted the building to stop swallowing this problem and spitting it back as somebody else's fault. Tanya filed her own complaint 2 days later after Leslie told her the timing was clean, and Marisol already had the building section in view. Moving day itself was not dramatic. No screaming in the driveway, no last speech. Darren did not show up. Rico did once in a work truck and gave me a look that landed between apology and relief. The new place was smaller and 20 minutes farther from Eli's school, but the walls were dry. The closet smelled like dust, not rot. The first night there, Eli walked into his room, dropped his backpack, sniffed once, and said, "It doesn't smell old in here." That line hit me harder than the settlement terms. For 2 years, I had been shaving this problem down into something survivable. A fan here, a paint job there, a careful text, a cheap explanation I accepted because moving felt harder than proving a wall was wet. What ended it was not one genius move. It was the point where I stopped arguing about what I smelled and started writing down what I could prove. Last I heard, Marisol kept the case open until full remediation and clearance testing were completed. And Darren had to answer for why 2 units carried the same leak pattern under the same stretch of wall. He lost because every time he tried to rename the problem, the paper got more specific. I did not feel victorious when it was over. I felt light. If you want more stories where the person with the paperwork wins instead of the person with the bluff, subscribe and like. I have a feeling I'm not the only one who learned the hard way that minor issue usually means somebody else plans to make it your problem.